Hello, this is International Master Nigel Povah. As many of you may know, Guildford Chess Club are celebrating our 125th anniversary this year, and we're staging a 125 board simultaneous on Guildford High Street on Saturday the 11th of September. And I want to show you a game now played by one of the masters who'll be playing in that simul. That's Grandmaster Nick Pert. And in this particular game, which was played in 2017, he was playing for Guildford in the 4NCL against the young FIDE master Peter Batchelor, who was playing for Grantham Sharks. The game opened d4, which is one of Nick's favourites, and it continued knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, e6, and now we've got a fairly standard Queen's Gambit declined position, and after knight c3 Peter chose to play bishop e7, and in this position bishop g5 is the most common move, but instead of bishop g5 Nick chose to play bishop f4, which is almost as popular as bishop g5 these days, and actually scores a little bit better and is much favoured by quite a lot of the top guys. So the game continued castles, e3, and now knight bd7 was played by Peter, which is second choice in this position, but a very reasonable move. c5 is the main line that's played here, but we won't go into that. That's a different variation, but again a perfectly respectable move. So knight bd7 was Peter's choice, and now the main move here is c5, grabbing some space on the queen side. But that wasn't Nick's choice, nor did he play h3, which is another move that's sometimes played in order to ensure the preservation of the bishop on f4 against a knight h5 attack. Instead, though, Nick chose to play bishop to e2, and this allows the capture on c4, which was Peter's move, which is in fact the main move in this position, because now that White's already moved his bishop to e2, recapturing on c4 will see him making a second move with the bishop, which he perhaps wouldn't really want to do quite at this stage of the opening. So instead of recapturing, which is indeed the main move, Nick chose to castle, continuing with his development. If we look quickly at what happens if he did recapture, which is perfectly reasonable, then often Black would continue with moves like a6, White might reply a4 to prevent b5, but now Black would play c5, which is standard sort of a Queen's Gambit accepted type of continuation, and after say castles, cd, queen takes d4, knight to b6, bishop dropping back to b3, Black can trade the queens off, and after the knight recapture play something like bishop to d7, and this position's equal, and it's been played about 40 odd times, and the majority of those games have resulted in draws. So bishop takes c4, for that reason, whilst perfectly reasonable, maybe isn't the most challenging, and so Nick plays the more adventurous move, castles, continuing with his development and waiting to see how Black continues. Now in the game, Peter chooses to play knight to d5, and we'll come to that in a second, but instead of that, in a recent high-level rapid game between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura, Hikaru attempted to hang on to the c4 pawn by playing knight to b6. It's the only way you can try and hang on to the pawn. Now that was met quite obviously by a4, aiming to drive the knight away, so Hikaru prevents that with a5, and Magnus now grabs the centre with e4, which gives him quite a nice position. And this now caused Hikaru to challenge that centre with c5. But the trouble with this move is it leaves a gaping hole on b5, which the white knight immediately jumps into, and as you can see there's an immediate threat of bishop to c7 forking the queen and the knight. So that means that Black's only got one move here, and that's knight to e8 to guard the c7 square. And after this, Magnus captured on c5, and that pawn can't be recaptured by the bishop because it would leave the Black queen on d8 undefended. So either Black has to trade queens on d1 or play as Hikaru did, knight back to d7. And after this, bishop takes c4, and now bishop takes c5. Queen to c2 was played, and after queen to e7 guarding the bishop and securing defence of the e6 square, Magnus played e5, and Magnus has just got an incredibly dominant position here. All of black's pieces are somewhat tied up. He's very cramped. It's not clear how he's going to continue, and getting his pieces out, the bishop on c8, the rook on a8, never mind also the knight on e8, is jolly difficult, and it's no surprise that Magnus went on to win this game 8 moves later. So this is the sort of thing that could happen if black tries to hang on to the pawn with that move knight to b6. But instead of knight to b6, Peter Batchelor put his knight on d5. Now this attacks the bishop on f4 and also threatens perhaps to exchange on c3. Anyway, Nick chose to capture the pawn now with his bishop, forcing the knight to do something or to be defended, and Peter chose to capture the bishop on f4. Nick recaptures, and although his pawn structure's been damaged and he's got an isolated queen's pawn now, it does give him good control over the e5 square and the possibility of bringing his rook to e1 and attacking down the e file. Anyway, the game continued, knight to b6, attacking the bishop, and here the bishop can drop back to either b3 or d3. Both moves have been played, but Nick chooses d3, which targets the weak h7 square and threats along that diagonal in general. And now Peter continued with knight d5, attacking the weak f-pawn, or the undefended f-pawn. So Nick defends it with g3, and in this position white is slightly better because of his central control, but it isn't significant. So black captures on c3, Nick recaptures, and now Peter plays a pretty sensible move. He attacks this centre in order to try and weaken it further and leave Nick with either an isolated queen's pawn again, or indeed weakened pawns on the c-file. So in this position, though, Nick just continues to ignore the threat and continues with his own development. In this position, he's got the possible threat of queen to e4, with obviously threat of mate on h7. So as a precautionary move, black plays g6 to prevent that particular danger. And now, after rook a to d1, Nick is more or less bringing all his pieces into development, and one imagines the f1 rook could go to e1. And so in this position, it makes sense for Peter Batchelor to bring his queen off the d file opposite the rook. And now Nick plays a very sensible move h4 with the intention of pushing on to h5, when he would be able to capture on g6 and thus weaken defence of the g6 square and generally soften up the black king side. This is quite a good plan in these types of positions when one's opponent has advanced his g-pawn. And white needn't fear it weakens his king side, because his king position is pretty secure. He can even consider, if he wishes in this position, possibly following up with moves like king to g2 and his rook from f1 to h1, with possible threats down the h-file once he's captured on g6. Anyway, back to after h4, and black now played b6, intending to put his bishop on the long diagonal. And in this position, Nick chooses to capture on c5, probably thinking or believing that the open d file could prove useful to him, and indeed it proves to be the case. And instead of capturing immediately with his queen on c5, queen takes c5, which is probably the natural move here and probably best, and probably results in equality. Instead of that, Peter Batchelor immediately put his bishop on b7, intending probably to play a quick queen to c6 and exert threats down the long white diagonal. So in this position, Nick doesn't want to allow that move, so he plays knight e5, which takes control of the c6 square, and also puts his knight on a useful square, further increasing the attacking threats against the white king side. So Peter now recaptures the pawn on c5 with his bishop, and Nick rightly continues, or sensibly continues, with h5. So you could say white's playing all the natural moves you'd expect from him, but the position is probably reasonably well balanced, and if Peter played rook from f8 to d8 here, then I think in this position the position will be equal, although both sides have to be very careful. White has some attacking chances against the king side, but equally this powerful white bishop on the long white diagonal and the threat of a queen say c6 always has to be prevented. But Peter unfortunately didn't play rook fd8. He instead chose to drive the knight away with f6 for the very reason I've just mentioned. He wants to be able to put his queen on c6, and if he can do that, it'll be incredibly powerful. For example, if the knight were to go to g4 here, queen c6 with a threat of queen g2 or queen h1 mate is horrendous. And note that pawn to f3 can't be played, blocking the diagonal, because the bishop on c5 pins that pawn. So he would have to give up a piece with bishop to e4, and it's pretty horrible if he has to do that. Similarly, if you put the knight on f3, queen to c6, king to d2, and now takes on h5, followed by putting the king on h8 and the rook on g8 and advancing the pawn to h4, sees black with all the sort of threats. Anyway, those are knight retreats, but after f6, Nick doesn't retreat his knight. Nick spots that he's got a much more powerful move. He plays bishop to b5, leaving his knight under attack, but intending to invade down the d file with his rook to d7. And this invasion, rook d7, can't be prevented. If, for example, rook a d8 is played to try and prevent the rook invasion, the rook comes in anyway, and after the capture, knight takes. Black is in real difficulties here because his rook is attacked, so is this pawn on e6, and there's no way of defending both. You can't, for example, play rook e8 because knight takes f6 check is horrible. So this didn't happen. Rook a d8 didn't happen. Instead, Peter grabbed the knight, but Nick now immediately launches his rook into the position. The queen's got to retreat. It's no other move for it. He went back to b8, and now Nick captured on g6. The pawn was recaptured, and he plays queen g4, which threatens both the e6 and the g6 pawns with check. Only one way of guarding them, so the rook's played to f6, and now Nick finds a very clever move. He dropped his queen back to h3, threatening queen to h7 check, and after king to f8, queen to h8 mate. And there's only one way of meeting that, which is rook to f7, which was the move played. And now after queen takes e6, the f7 rook is really in great trouble, and there's no effective way of guarding this. So in fact, in this position, Peter resigned. If, for example, queen to f8 were played, bishop c4 is just the end of the game. The rook can't be guarded, and notice that if in this position he played a move like bishop to c8, then white can play queen takes check, and then he can take the rook on f7 next move. So that would be horrific. So in the game, or rather if in the game instead queen to e8 had been played rather than queen to f8, then again queen takes g6 check, king to f8, and rook takes b7 is a really nice way of finishing the game, because if queen takes b7 here, queen takes f7 is mate, and if rook takes b7 instead, then bishop takes e8 would see white winning. So this was a really powerful display by Nick, who is a strong grandmaster, great positional understanding, but also very tactically capable. And Nick, was indeed former world under-18 champion back in, I think, 1998 or 1999, and currently I think he's England's number 6 or 7. So he is a really strong grandmaster, and if you get to play in the Simul on Saturday the 11th and get to play against Nick, you can be sure of a very challenging game. Anyway, I hope to see some of you along there for the Simul on the 11th, and I'm going to give another game shortly, won by international master Andrew Martin, who is also one of the masters giving the Simul on a Saturday. Okay, thanks.